Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, welcome back. I'm Melinda Crane, and I have the honor and the pleasure to moderate this panel on making transport safer. And we have a fantastic selection of panelists to talk about the subject. Just a few introductory words before we get started. You may need your headphones. We will be hearing from Mr. Levitin in Russian, so make sure, please, that you do have a headset if you are going to need it. And I believe for English, it's channel 11. Not sure about other languages, but you probably all know that better than I do by now. The statistics, of course, speak for themselves. Road traffic has become the leading killer of young people worldwide. Collisions cost more than $520 billion every year in health, property, premature death, and lost income. And in many low and middle income countries, the toll from road accidents adds up to 3% of GDP. This month marked the launch of the UN Decade of Action on Road Safety. Many industrialized countries are now moving to what they call a safe systems approach that sees safety as a shared responsibility and targets a zero fatality goal. In this panel, we want to talk more about that approach. We want to try to identify what big safety improvements might be in the pipeline. We also want to ask whether governments are ready to commit the necessary resources in an area of shrinking budgets. And we want to look at best practices and ask how they can be made useful and affordable for low and middle income countries. We'll also take a look at other sectors, asking how industrialized countries can maintain their current good safety records in the rail, air, and maritime sectors, and also promote similar levels in other modes, and whether lessons learned in one mode are applicable in others. As I said, we have a fantastic, there come our channels, by the way, so if you need help finding the right channel, here you see it, 11 for English, 10 for French, 9 for Russian, and 8 for German. And I'm just going to briefly read off the names and titles of our panelists. You do also see them above our heads, and I will spare us long introductions so that we can get right to the meat of our matter. And we're also very much looking forward to hearing from all of you in the audience with your questions in about the last half hour of our discussion. So starting from the left hand, we have Katarina Elmsäter-Svärd. I hope I said that more or less correctly. She is the Minister for Infrastructure of Sweden. Then we have Karim Ghelab. He is the Minister of Equipment and Transport of Morocco. We have Catherine King, who is Parliamentary Secretary for Infrastructure and Transport from Australia. Igor Levitin is the Minister of Transport from the Russian Federation. Thierry Mariani is the Secretary of State for Transport of France. José Luis Irigoyen is the Director of Transport for the World Bank, and Etienne Krug is the Director of the Department for Violence and Injury Prevention and Disability at the World Health Organization. Welcome to all of you. We're very pleased that you can be on this podium today. Mrs. Svärd, Sweden has adopted Vision Safe Systems and Vision Zero as with a target of zero fatalities. Actually, you were already doing pretty well. You have 2.8 fatalities per 100,000 residents in Sweden. Can you really hope to get it down any further with the Vision Zero approach?
Is it on?
Should be.
Maybe so. Yes, here it goes. If you're just looking at figures, you might start to think that Vision Zero sounds a bit crazy. But when we adopted this vision in 1997 in Sweden, it was more to be sure of that this is something to be really top on mind, because it has to start with your mind, and all stakeholders must have the same way of thinking. No one should get killed by cars, or no one should get badly injured as well. And that means that we have all the stakeholders, no matter if you are a politician, if you are making cars, if you are planning the city, if you are planning or building or construct infrastructure. With this kind of mindset, we have noticed, and our experience is that there is a way to go. And I would like to give you a short example, because sometimes we think that we can think because we are humans. But suddenly we don't think anymore. And then we have technique coming up to help us become better drivers when we, for example, are drinking coffee or whatever we do when we are driving. But still, if we don't have the right mindset, it doesn't work. Because we all know that belts will save lots of life. Therefore, almost every car producers are having belts in new cars. And if we don't put the belt on, the technique will remind us with this beep beep sound. And then we know, okay, I have to put my belt on. But if you don't have the right mind, do you know what people do? They take the belt behind the seat and make the sound stop. They don't have the right mind on top.
So I'm hearing you tell us that improving safety is about both behavioral methods and also about new technologies. Australia is going down the road of new technologies. Many of us have just been at this e-safety demonstration this afternoon and seen some rather impressive crashes. What exactly are you now mandating in Australia in the way of e-safety, and why?
Well, certainly in terms of electronic stability control, that will be mandatory in Australia in November. And we see it as one of a suite of measures that we can adopt to get our road toll down. We've had similar experience to other developing countries where 1970 was our worst year ever for road fatalities, and then we spent a large period of time over the course of the last 20 years with compulsory seatbelt wearing, speed cameras, with drink driving legislation, a whole range of behaviour change education programs. But the road toll really over the last 10 years has plateaued, and it's plateaued at around about 1,400 people, and for our population that's quite large, but with 32,000 people becoming injured as well. So we are working, again, we've adopted the Safe Systems approach. Our new National Road Safety Strategy was just actually agreed last week. We've just launched that. And we believe that mandating certainly global regulations is one of the ways that we can certainly work towards getting our road toll down. But we do think it's important that regulations are international. It certainly makes us easier if we develop them all together, but also if we adopt them all together, it certainly makes it much easier domestically.
In terms of the safe system approach, as I understand it, it's about shared responsibility, and it's often said that we no longer are going to blame one party. What exactly does that mean? Can you elaborate a bit on that for us?
Well, I think it comes, and our WHO colleague might be able to talk a bit more about this, but I think it comes from taking a really strong public health injury prevention perspective to road safety. It actually says that there are a range of interventions you can take, and that it is not just one level of intervention that will actually change what's happening with road safety. We do know that if there are significant improvements in the structure of our roads, or if we retrofit some of our roads with safety measures, we can get road fatalities down. We do know safer vehicles. I mean, the development has just been extraordinary in terms of the sorts of things that we've seen in our vehicles. But we do know that it still requires people who are driving cars to drive responsibly and to stick with speed limits, to not use their mobile phones in their hands, to not drink and drive, and to not take drugs. We certainly know that it's not rocket science, but trying to get all of those things together is actually quite difficult. And I think the Safe Systems approach has certainly provided us with a really good way of actually looking at the levels of intervention we can take on road safety.
Mrs. King just mentioned the WHO, so let's just leap right over to Etienne Krug. The UN has launched its decade of action on road safety. What's the goal here? Is this mostly a public education endeavor, and how would you speak to the point that I just discussed with Mrs. King?
It's much more than a public education endeavor. It's really a decade to implement the safe systems approach that has been just described, as well as elements of Vision Zero. Together with our colleagues from the UN regional commissions, from actually representatives from all of the panel here and many others, we developed a plan for this decade. So this is not just a UN decade with a flag and that's it. It's a decade with a clear plan and an objective of saving 5 million lives over the next 10 years. How are we going to do that? We're going to work on all of the elements of the safe system. Improving the road infrastructure, making sure that what's existing is improved and what's being built, and here our friends from the World Bank can talk more, is up to the best standards. Improving the vehicles, we've just seen some examples of what can be done. Improving behavior, we know that today only 15% of the countries in the world have the right legislation on key risk factors such as speed, drink driving, seat belts, motorcycle helmets, and child seats. And then improving trauma care. We're going to act together, the international community as well as the governments, on implementing that plan, and we believe it's possible. We believe really that we know what needs to be done now, and it's a question of political will and implementing it. And we're really excited because when the decade was launched on the 11th of May, more than 120 countries hosted events at the head of state level, many of them committing. Mexico launched a plan as well as dozens of other countries based on the global plan. So I think it's possible.
Minister Levitin, where does Russia stand at the moment? As I understand, the ITF has been involved in a peer review of transport policy and the transport situation in Russia. What were the findings that were made in regard to safety? Where do things stand in your country?
Спасибо. Я хочу сказать, что 5 лет тому назад в России была принята новая программа по безопасности дорожного движения. В ней мы взяли опыт Франции, потому что считаем, что во Франции
5 years ago, Russia adopted a program to enhance the security, and we looked at France, and we said, well, France offers an excellent example. We've been able to reduce the number of fatalities by 8,000 in the last 5 years, so we think that we have opted for the right way to go when we adopted the program. We had an international forum in Moscow 2 years ago. This was about international safety and transport safety, and I would like to thank all those who were involved. This was inspiring.
As I understand it, Minister Levitin, one of the most serious problems is pedestrian fatalities. 40% of fatalities, as I understand it, are pedestrians. What is the cause of that, and what are you doing about it?
Да, здесь проблема как водителя, так и пешехода.
Right. That's a problem, and involved are the drivers and the pedestrians. This is about the discipline in road traffic, and we need more discipline all the way. So what do we do in order to help pedestrians? We put more traffic lights in the streets, and they also show how many time is left to cross the street. So you get the number of seconds until the pedestrian will see a red light. And then we have cameras in order to record drivers who don't comply with the traffic code. And we also try to put traffic lights in a greater distance of pedestrians. We've also found that often pedestrians are still on the road when the drivers see a green light. So we might have to put the traffic lights in a greater distance in order to lengthen the period pedestrians have in order to cross the street. But there is another issue I would like to raise. There are lots of fatalities also, people who die when they cross a railway track. And actually, we had such an accident also during this conference. There was a truck and a car, and both tried to cross a railway track, and there was an accident, as I said. So maybe we should adopt an international standard in order to enhance railroad safety too.
Thank you. I want to come back in a moment to the role that IT.
Ich mich noch kurz auf die Rolle eingehen, die ITS, intelligente Transportsysteme, spielen können. Aber bevor wir das machen, an Frankreich die Frage, Minister Mariani.
What I read in the statistics, you've seen a 20% increase in fatalities this year. What is that attributable to? Does it have anything to do with the financial crisis, with the fact that you're seeing economic recovery, or have you perhaps been able to spend less on prevention due to the budget pressures? What's your explanation?
C'est 20% d'augmentation sur le mois d'avril. C'est heureusement.
Well, 20%, those are the figures which date back to April. It's not 20% throughout the entire year. Nevertheless, this is very disconcerting and we need to take action, of course. What about our situation? Well, in the 1970s in France, as a matter of fact, there were 12,000 fatalities per annum on the road. There was a safety policy which gradually took hold. In 2002, the number of fatalities on the roads was 8,000, was down to 8,000, and last year we stayed even below that toll. So from 12,000 in the 1970s, we brought this down to 4,000 per annum. Over the past 10 years, we've been able to halve the figure. All of this was, of course, to do with a very rigid or stringent safety policy, transport safety policy. Jacques Chirac back then got together with the Home Affairs Minister, Sarkozy, in order to come up with various safety measures. There was a very stringent transport policy for speeding, whatever. And there were also very stiff court sentences here, and this is no longer possible. If you get so the law is really applied rigorously, and this, of course, has increased the credibility of the law. And the latest figures point out that this was right, and last year we had assaults which amounted to 685, or murders which amounted to 685, and there were 900 pedestrians and cyclists who lost their lives. And there is also a kind of traffic crime, with 30%, which accounts for 30% more fatalities than a conventional crime. There was a 14% increase, and the government adopted stringent measures 2 weeks ago to sanction speeding, to follow up on speedings. The cameras were set up to catch people speeding, and people really prosecute this much more severely. So you lose your license really quickly now. 3,900 fatalities on the roads. 2% were motorists and 30% were cyclists. So you see a split between the various transportation modes. So the policy really became more stringent. This did not create more popularity for politicians, but nevertheless it's a matter of political commitment. The first speeding camera was set up by Sarkozy when he was Minister of Home Affairs, and of course he did not create a lot of friends in general there back then.
Philosophy behind some of that resistance. But let's go first to Morocco and ask Minister Ghalab, is this whole safe systems approach relevant for lower and middle income countries? Is this an approach that you can really realistically implement?
Oui, effectivement. Donc la question de...
safety in transportation has the highest priority for us. And in Morocco, there is a big problem with unsafe roads. Also, if you compare us to other countries, there are 4,000 fatalities per annum also in Morocco on the road. And if you compare this, of course, this is the same figure as France, but we only have 1/5 of the vehicles on the road, in terms of compared to France. So you see that the order of magnitude is higher in our country. We adopted a new law in October 2010. And people already talked about political determination, political willpower. You need political leadership. You need political commitment. You must not be lenient and really follow up on this sanction crime on the roads. And there were certain discussions in the Moroccan parliament before we could finally adopt this law. For 3 years, there were major strikes, 2007, 2009, against this law. But due to the major political leadership and determination and the ensuing negotiations, but also due to the determination by the policymakers, we could finally adopt this law in October. In the first 3 months, it already paid off. In the last 3 months, 2010, this led to 20% less fatalities on the road. So you see that this law really had an immediate impact on road safety. So it's about a system which is associated with automatic control speeding cameras. You get a ticket for speeding. And alcohol testing is also very important. We're a Muslim country, and therefore people said, actually, it's not an issue, drunk driving. But it turns out that there is drunk driving. Also in Morocco, there are also Moroccans who drink alcohol, and this also leads to accidents on our roads. Therefore, we also factored in drunk driving tests. This was again accompanied by a very interesting political debate. We also introduced a kind of professional license for any professional drivers, like people driving buses, coaches, taxis, etc. They have a special license, professional license, and they get special induction training. Just to give you one example, the professional or vocational driver's license is mandatory for all drivers who are already in the business. But they have to undergo further training every 5 years. So this means that we already have 5,000 professional drivers on the roads who have to undergo professional training over the next 5 years again in order to renew their vocational license. So we really adopt a holistic approach with regard to resolving this problem.
Financing, to what degree are the safety problems in your country simply a reflection of inadequate funding?
Alors, pour le financement de la sécurité routière.
Well, inadequate funding, that's a good question. Of course, there is a close correlation here between unsafe roads and the means which you can make available for safety on the roads. This is the most difficult task. Because you need to change the mindset. People need to be re-educated. And of course, you need to invest funds here. And there was not an awful lot of earmarking of funds for these topics. So people tend to penalize and sanction certain misdemeanors. But of course, you need to also educate people and proactively change their mindset. People need to undergo training. It requires capacity building. Of course, that costs money. But the largest cost devolves upon the improvement of the infrastructure. This means that you need to improve public transport. All of this, of course, costs money. And this is the largest sum which is required. And for Morocco, it's really important that we invest here. We made available, or we increased the funds available by the factor of 4 for the building of our infrastructure, motorways, etc. In the old days, we had a motorway network of 440 kilometers, and by the end of this month, we're going to open the one we will have added almost 1,000 kilometers more than 10 years ago to the motorway network. So we have realized that it is important to prioritize here to make the funds available, but the funding is not necessarily the biggest problem.
And middle-income countries condemned to follow the same motorization, the same traffic, and the same safety patterns and problems that the developed world has had?
Hope not. Obviously, when you see the statistics, this is really striking. So we talk about 1.3 million people dying as a result of road accidents, and 90% are in the developing world.
So, can you hold your microphone a bit up? Yep.
90% are in the developing world. So really, we have a problem there that is run out of proportion. And as you said at the very beginning, even the amount of money that is spent because of this in terms of life costs and asset destruction is even higher than the whole budget that goes into the aid programs. So definitely improving infrastructure to make it a forgiving infrastructure like the one is required under a system approach will require lots of resources, particularly when you see the starting point of some of the countries and also the challenge they face. Rapid urbanization, for example, with rapid motorization in the developing world, will put enormous pressure into the systems. But the reality, what we are seeing as the top priority, the one that will give us the better results, the most effective results, has to do with the governance system. And in that sense, I fully agree with the Minister from Morocco. Governance here, what we mean is the legislation, the regulatory framework, but also the institution capable of taking responsibility for this issue. If you look at, you mentioned at the very beginning also comparison with other systems. Aviation, they have a very good record. In aviation, there is the data that the International Civil Aviation Organization has shows clearly that oversight is of the essence. So if you have a civil aviation authority that is doing a strict job in terms of enforcing and monitoring the standards, you have good results. In the road sector, a similar approach has not been common. We see that the lack of a leading agency that is empowered to assume the responsibility is hindering the effectiveness of these programs. They tend to be short-lived. There is a reaction, some political leadership, but then it vanishes. So governance is an institution and results, monitoring continuously these results, measuring these results, because you will be having dramatic improvements at certain points, then go back. With increases in fatalities, you have to try another combination of measures. So continuous monitoring will be of the essence.
Mr. Levitin, the need to have a strong institutional leadership was just mentioned, lead agency. I know that this, of course, is part of the ITF's recommendations that this kind of leadership take place. How has that worked out in your country? Who has taken the lead? Has that proven effective in terms of institutional capability to improve safety?
Я хочу сказать, что сегодня в России...
Well, let me put it as follows. Legislation in Russia today stipulates that the Ministry of the Interior is in charge of road safety, and this is probably no different from other countries. Every country has a legislation which is, so to speak, the basis of any decision to be taken with respect to road safety. However, there are no international standards. And if we talk about motorized vehicles, that's not private cars only, that's also trucks. And Russia is also a transit country. I think that we need international standards. Now, whether you need a federal agency or authority or not, that's another story. I mean, currently we don't want to establish an agency. This is a matter of the police.
That was the reason that the Interior Ministry was decided upon as lead agency, because this is an enforcement issue up to the police? I'd like to ask our representatives from Australia and Sweden, looking at your experience, what are the 3 biggest errors that you would want to see other countries avoid? I'm going to ask you later about the 3 biggest recommendations for what you think should be adopted, but let's start with mistakes.
Well, I think the 2 questions probably go together in one sense. In that
you can link them if you like.
Yeah, I will. You can't just do one thing, and you also can't be half-hearted about what you do. I think that it's important to understand that behaviour change programs have to come in with regulatory action, with enforcement action, with work on roads. It is an integrated approach between health and between transport that is needed as well. We have a federation, so we have states and territories that we have to work with as well. So you can't be half-hearted, and you can't just do one thing. You can't just think that putting a television program on or a billboard is in itself going to do anything. You've got to take, literally, as it says, the safe systems approach. You have to look at everything, and you can't just take one element of that, or it just won't work. It also has to be sustained. Constantly good data collection, constantly monitoring what you're actually doing, evaluating the interventions that you're taking as well, and putting resources into that sort of research and development and evaluation and monitoring is important as well.
Mrs. Webb?
Well, it's harder to say what to avoid, but maybe don't think separately among modes. Mm-hmm. Maybe don't start with the toughest, the biggest, from the beginning. And maybe don't think that people doesn't want or can.
Sorry, people
doesn't want or can.
So confidence in people's ability to go along with the campaign?
Yes. And then, if you have that of your mind, then you know how to work with this with another attitude, because attitudes are the most difficult to change, of course.
Then that's a very good lead back to Minister Mariani with the question of the popular resistance in France. There was a major demonstration just a few weeks ago in which very angry motorists tried to, I gather, remove some of the speed cameras that had been put in place or destroy them. Clearly, they felt that they were trading off freedom for safety, and they weren't willing to make that trade-off. Is that right?
Il y a 2 questions contre des rois là.
Well, there are different reasons why people want to embark on a revolution, and this was a revolution against radar. Now, after the negative reactions in the month of April, and I gave you the figures in my last presentation, the government said we have to react in view of this almost brutal situation, and part of the population did not want to play along. And of course we know that the internet makes it much easier today to mobilize people, and after 18 hours it was possible to reach a compromise, and some of the radar cameras were removed, and there were also signals put in the street. I mean, in the past, there had often been signs on the streets so that people knew what a radar was. So they approached the radar, they slowed down, but right after the radar, they sped up again. And this is not the right way to go either. So the compromise in the end was we will establish a so-called pedagogical radar cameras, and we will also have police officers nearby or behind those cameras in order to make sure that people don't pass them and then speed up again. And we will see whether this works. I mean, we have seen a going down trend for several years. And, of course, people are discussing about radars. Radars are getting increasingly sophisticated. We have now radars by helicopter, on boats, and embedded radars. And people have the feeling that it's getting a bit too much as well, which is certainly also one of the reasons why people protested. But prevention is certainly necessary. And there are certainly those who are affected by accidents or who have family members who are affected by accidents who are maybe easier to approach. But we do have to have this campaign in order to do something about the idea in France that one has to revolt against this new imperialism of radars.
Much more are we willing to commit in the way of resources to additional safety benefits? Of course, it's always a question of trade-offs. In the case of road safety, does it actually make sense to invest even more in this particular mode, or should we perhaps actually be investing in trying to get people to switch to other safer modes? I know this was a question that came up yesterday in the health panel, but it would seem to have equal relevance for the safety area. Cycling, for instance, instead of driving.
It's not an either or. We know that for a while we'll continue to use cars, and therefore that aspect of our transportation system certainly needs to be made safer. And I just want to quickly agree with Mr. Mayani about the importance of listening to the victims and those who have been affected by car crashes. I come across so many of them in my work, and I think we cannot remain insensitive, and people hearing their call certainly will be willing to make more sacrifices with their freedom. But of course, it's extremely important we don't invest, and Jeffrey Sachs was very strong on that this morning, in a system of transportation based solely on cars. And the more we can shift towards safe public transportation, I'm saying safe because in many countries public transportation remains still very unsafe, and cycling and walking from the World Health Organization, that's of course our message, because not only is it good for road safety to cycle and to walk, but it's also good for all kinds of other health issues, prevention of chronic diseases, etc. But to be able to shift to more walking and cycling and public transportation, we need to put the infrastructure in place so that this can be done safely. But I think our big message to the rest of the world, the 95% of deaths occurring in the low and middle income countries, is that please, as Jeffrey Sachs said, don't adopt necessarily our modes of transportation based on cars, but think ahead and try to think about a much more balanced transportation mode.
Mr. Gelab, when we talk about popular resistance and hindrances to enforcement, corruption, of course, is a major one. What is your country doing to combat corruption in this area? Which, of course, is particularly in the area of road safety, payment of fines and so on, offers an ideal vehicle for corruption.
Alors, tout à l'heure, quand vous posiez la question...
Now, you asked before what the mistakes are one should not make. And I would like to answer this question first. In other words, we should do away with systems which don't allow for a transparent implementation of the laws. Corruption is to be seen in this context. Corruption is often an agreement between public servants or other representatives of the government who don't work according to their principles, and citizens who don't want to pay a fine. Now, we are about to implement a law which does not allow for any subjectivity. In other words, each non-compliance, each act of a violation of the law triggers a police answer or an answer by the judicial system. Secondly, we need measuring systems, and that's also part of the law. And in other words, this means that there are in the new law clear statements concerning the measures to be undertaken. For example, in the past, it was possible when it wasn't clear what the weight of a vehicle was to use manipulated scales. Today, this is not possible anymore because the law clearly stipulates the control mechanisms to be applied. And the third aspect is you clearly have to know the law, and that goes for the citizens. And that's why we have published 3 guidebooks, so to speak. One for pedestrians, and there is a list of all the acts of non-compliance or of violation of the traffic code, and the pedestrian sees what act triggers what answer. And we also have a guidebook for the controlling agencies, and we also have a special a guidebook for professional drivers, bus drivers, taxi drivers, or truck drivers. So it's always the same law, but of course it's explained in different ways for the representatives of the administration and the citizens respectively. And then of course you have conflicts, like conflict between a police officer and a citizen, and with the help of these booklets, the citizen knows what punishment is to be expected in the case of which infringement. In addition, if I may, when citizens feel that there is equity, i.e. equality in the treatment of everybody involved, they are much eager to play along. This was also a European initiative according to EU ideas. There was to be a harmonized approach all over Europe. Now, we have lots of accidents in the frontier regions of France, and accidents are caused by people with cars without a French license plate. So there need to be solutions for these particular problems as well. And then it's important that the 27 member states of the EU make sure that the European directive is being implemented in all European countries, even if you have different tempo or speed limits in different countries.
Back in just a moment to what we need.
Because otherwise you always get the impression that you get away, without being punished.
Mr. Levitin, do you in Russia also hope to realize benefits in fighting corruption from automaticity? We heard Mr. Caleb talking about the merits of automatic systems in reducing the role of, say, human error in the process. Is this the case in your country as well?
Хочу два момента сказать.
Well, actually, we need to do everything. We need to do our utmost so as to make sure that the driver, at the end of the day, assumes their own responsibility, and however that there are no endless discussions with the policemen. We need more automation. And we adopted a law that, for instance, the gross vehicle weight has been mentioned, and if there is an excess of the vehicle weight, there needs this needs to be sanctioned. I mean, if somebody sends a lorry and declares the wrong weight, he or she will have to pay. They will have to pay. They will have to be penalized. I mean, if it's a foreign driver who's driving without money, I mean, he's usually the lorry drivers don't carry cash around with them, then there was always a problem. I mean, what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to, put them in jail, or are you supposed to let them get off? And we moved away from this. The driver can keep on driving, but the shipper is asked to pay a penalty. So we follow up on the existing laws when there are vehicle weight violations, and there need to be homogeneous rules. It has been harmonized rules. It has been mentioned that even in Europe there are no standard rules, no harmonized rules, and therefore it becomes more difficult if drivers going in transit through other countries where there are no harmonized rules. I think especially in the field of transport we need this system of standards and rules, and these are already around in aviation, in the maritime sector, so it is possible to have them. You need harmonized rules also for cargo, for freight. And what about drivers who are driving and getting tired after very long hours? And many accidents in Russia are to do with the fact that drivers simply fall asleep if they're driving a truck. And I think also in this area we really need to monitor the rest hours of drivers, and we need rules for this, harmonized rules.
Mr. Irigoyen had his hand up a moment ago, and I hope you are going to address also these issues of international regulation and harmonization.
On the issue of corruption and the role of the police in enforcing, I think we have come a long way, and technology has come in the rescue in terms of bringing objectivity. But nevertheless, we realize that it's important to have a police that is seen as in close contact with the community, engage with the community in creating a safe environment for pedestrians and for drivers, rather than sporadic controls here and there. And since you need to have these controls where the police will be involved, it's of the essence that you change the culture of these organizations in some countries. So in this respect, for example, you can see in Argentina that they created a lead agency, and you start seeing results by involving the police in alcohol control, for example, and the community and the people at large, they realize that this is positive. So what we have, with the assistance of the Global Road Safety Facility, what we are doing is creating a network of high-level police officers that can talk to their colleagues in the developing world. And it's called RoadPol, and involves police from different countries that have very good experience in this sense. We believe that having them talk to their colleagues will have a more significant impact. The dialogue will be much better.
So institution building, in a sense, in the corruption area.
Yes.
What about harmonization? That we've heard several calls for better international standards, harmonization of standards. What needs to be done in that area, and what is being done?
Well, definitely in terms of setting standards, this is the way to go. And in each country, they are adopting standards that they believe they can enforce. Would be of the essence trying to harmonize these standards, and would be also very important to ensure that the private sector, particularly those companies that are very closely involved in transportation, for example, adopt these standards. The corporate social responsibility here can go a very long way in terms of the adoption of sensible policies in terms of driving, not only in terms of, as the minister was saying, the schedule, ensuring that drivers are not tired, but also the way they drive. And then the other aspect would be to maintain momentum, to ensure that you sustain the effort to create accountability mechanisms. We are seeing in the developing world the emergence of NGOs that are specialized in this field, and they are continuously raising and creating a momentum around road safety that is very positive. And they are also providing targeted knowledge to address some of the concerns we have, and specialized knowledge.
Mr. Krupp?
Just maybe 2 words also on the issue of harmonization and standards to remind that there are a number of instruments that exist in the UN regional commissions. There are bodies to do that. There are UN rules and conventions. And so the big issue is not maybe more of that, but rather using what we have, adhering to the existing conventions, implementing them more than anything else. What I think is important on the international level, and we've seen some of that emerging in the last few years, also is better sharing of experiences. We have now so many successful experiences, Sweden, Australia, France, but also emergence in Russia, in Morocco, and a number of other places. We need to learn lessons from there, try to share them better, try to see how we can adapt some of these realities to other settings and use that, which is what we are trying to do through the UN Road Safety Collaboration, a network of international agencies who's trying to share that information because I think lots of progress can be done there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Coming back to best practices, I would like to ask Mrs. Swerd and Mrs. King how much we can expect from technology. You've both pointed out it has to be a mix. It has to be regulation, there has to be public education, but technology has a role to play. And as I understood you in the beginning, Mrs. Swerd, you told us essentially technology can compensate for human error, can at the margin improve a safety situation where perhaps there have been human failings. So how much improvement can we still hope for? What are the best prospects out there, do you think, in terms of ITS, in terms of e-safety, and why aren't they being adapted faster?
Well, I think there are many reasons of that but I think maybe in the beginning you were talking about the financial crisis and so on. We are in different situations, all countries, so for me, it's more to have more out of less. That means, for example, that we have lots of experiences and maybe we have come far in Sweden, but there is more to do. So technique and ITS is for us the next step. But I was thinking in the discussion before when I said that don't make the biggest step first. We have tried to introduce in Sweden, first of all, we have all the 4 modes together to learn of experiences. As Igor Levitin mentioned about the railways and what happens with people died on tracks and railways, we have figures that are actually increasing right now. So we have to learn more how we do with this, learn from the road sector when it comes to safety. But also small steps. For example, speed limit. I do agree on what Marianne said about these cameras. Even in Sweden, people were very, very irritated about these cameras. But after some years, and they know that the figures are much better, they are getting more and more accepted. But right now we have a discussion because we have many roads that are not motorways. They are very curvy and we had lots of hills, and they are front collisions. And therefore we are more of have mid barriers and 2+1 lanes. That means that we can have higher speed, no collisions, less death. So that's one way as well as also. But the other thing that we are trying that make people crazy is where we not have these medium barriers and we have mixed the speed limit in many various ways, like 30 kilometers or 40 or 50 or 60 or 80 or whatever. And they come on a nice road and say, why can't we drive 90 kilometers an hour? And the speed limit is 80. And they used to be driving in 90 before. And we say, well, it's not separated the fields, so it will cause us much more accidents. And they are very irritating. But after a while, they start also to understand that there is no accidents anymore on these roads. So it's both technique in cars, in the way of see what's happening with cameras or whatever. But there is also much less to do that even gets more outcome of it.
And clearly making the benefits visible from what you say. Mrs. King, your government decided to mandate some of these e-safety features that we were talking about earlier. Why did it decide to do it this way? Wouldn't demand and the market bring it in eventually anyway?
I think it's a mixture of both, and I think we're seeing that happen certainly with emerging technologies where consumer demand and the marketing of smart car companies is really seeing some of the safety measures. But certainly with electronic stability control, it is absolutely evident that it provides a really good gain, and certainly governments are after and are looking for where those gains might be. So I think it is a bit of both. I think it's a bit of push from governments, but also a bit of pull from consumers as well that will do it. And I think there's no doubt, I mean, technology will absolutely have a significant role to play in terms of road safety. It's not the only role. That's what we really want to emphasise, that it's across the board. But certainly technology, I mean, we couldn't have imagined when we look back 20 years just the sort of design of cars that we have now. Of course, technology can also be a distractor from driving safely as well. We've now got lots of entertainment systems in cars. We've got global positioning systems that allow people to do things. We've got lots of mobile phone usage and other technology as well. So there's a bit of a balancing act in terms of technology as well that we have to look at about how we manage that as communities as well.
Mr. Irigoyen, to what degree can, should, and does the World Bank mandate safety considerations in its loans? And if you do it, do you prescribe, for instance, if it is in regard to a road, do you prescribe road design for safety purposes, or do you leave it up to the recipient to decide how to realize the safety that's mandated?
In our road projects, we have what we call road safety audits. So a design and the new design for a road has to pass an audit from an expert that sees that the design conforms to good practice. So we are trying to introduce this practice, and not only for our projects. So if an institution in the country, the road agency in the country, can adopt this kind of approach and use it for the whole program as opposed to the programs that we finance. In the end, although we provide many loans and our road portfolio is very big, it's just a drop in the bucket in terms of what the countries are doing. Definitely, we have learned a lot from the time that we were suggesting interventions that were removing, for example, black spots, to the current interventions now, where we are, for example, rolling out what we call a rapid an assessment of the infrastructure, the network, that looks in terms of the interaction, not only the road design, but the interaction with the pedestrians, for example. And then we can come up with a rating the roads according to safety. This has helped also in building the skills of agencies dealing with road safety within these road agencies.
Two very brief questions, and then I would like to go to the audience. I talked a moment ago about whether we shouldn't be considering trying to switch more traffic onto two wheels or foot. We certainly shouldn't apparently be switching it onto two motorized wheels. Minister Mariani, from the statistics that I saw, motorcycles are by far the most dangerous thing on the road. What do we do about that? My provocative question when I saw those statistics was, shouldn't they be banned?
Dans les mesures qui ont été
Well, that's a good question. Which measures did we adopt last week? Well, especially in the field of motor vehicles, of two-wheelers, motorized two-wheel vehicles, there was motorbikes, etc. There were stringent requirements. Somebody who drives a smaller scooter, like something, I mean, if you haven't been driving on the motorbike for 5 years, you need to undergo training. If you've been off your motorbike for a longer period, you need to go to another training class. So we try to sensitize people for anything that has to do with education. So try to sensitize them with regard to pedestrians and cyclists, etc. That's of course very tricky, because it's prevention, and the success of these preventative campaigns depends on the preparedness of those people driving a motorbike because they are most vulnerable. 2% of all vehicles are driven by motorbikes, and 30% of all accidents are caused by motorbikes. So there was a host of measures in the past, but of course we try to bank on sensitization and further education.
I understand that Sweden, with all its concern for safety, does not forbid cell phone use while at the wheel?
That's true. I think we are the only country left to.
Why?
It's more of thinking of actually what are people doing when they are driving. We can see them reading paper, drinking coffee, mixing on the radio or GPS or whatever. We have a law that says that the first and almost the only thing that you are supposed to do when you are driving is just driving. And of course, it's better if you use the headset, of course, instead of this hand holding. Because the next question is it just holding the cell phone that's the worst, or could it maybe be the call itself, what you are talking about, that make you lovely conversation or angry conversation and make you distractions? So for us, it's more of do what you're supposed to do. That's the first thing. But there is an opinion going on in Sweden that we should put this into a law. I'm very afraid of that we'll then say that we should not have this kind of technique at all in cars. And for me, and the way that we are thinking it, that more and more of new technique is to help the driver to become a better driver. So what we are doing is learning more on this, but we haven't adopted this as it's forbidden.
Thank you very much. Oh, yes, briefly to Mr. Krug, and then please, audience questions.
Just briefly on that point, because we get a lot of discussion around that, and we've just compiled all the evidence on distracted driving, particularly the use of phone. And actually, the risk is 4 times higher to have a crash if you drive talking on the phone, regardless if you're holding the phone or if it's hand-free phone. So the risk is definitely higher because it's more the distraction of talking than the using of the phone. The problem is what do you do about it? Because if people are using the technology in the car as it exists now, you don't know if they're singing, if they're talking to themselves, or if they're talking to a phone. So enforcing legislation, that's the problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, your questions, please. Raise, here in the front row. Good. Okay, I see 3 here. One over here.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank...
Just say who you are, please.
Eva Mornar, UNEC Director of Transportation. So first of all, I would like to thank Minister Levitin mentioning the issue of road rail level crossing. And maybe this is an announcement that at the invitation of UIC and IRCAD, a road rail level crossing intersectional group is under establishment to develop safety standards, similarly how the tunnel safety standards were developed for rail and road tunnels a couple of years ago. Now, a more difficult thing, a question to José Luis Irigoyen. I hear you saying that there is a need for an international organization on road transport to look after the road transport issues. I wonder what you would like to do then with the 60 years of experience of government working together to develop 57 different inland transport UN agreements to promote safety, environmental protection. Well, our division is servicing the World Forum of Harmonization of Vehicle Regulations. Does it mean that in your vision, the World Forum is to be closed down? The Road Safety Forum, the WP1, is to be closed down with the UN Road Safety legal instruments? Because this is what you have said. So please clarify.
The comparison with aviation, I mentioned the civil aviation authorities in a given country. These are the ones that...
Ich habe auf die Zivilluftfahrt angesprochen und wir kennen ja alle die Statistiken.
Oh, what we want to see is a lead agency in the country that takes control and accountability for the results.
Okay, I had a question here, and then I have 2, 3 more back here. Could you raise your hands again, please? Yes, here in the second row, and then in there. And yes, go ahead.
I'm coming back to this level crossing as well.
If you would say who you are, please.
Sorry. My name is Artur from Royal Dutch Transport Association. In the discussion, I noticed that the focus is very much on road users. We also know that a lot can be gained by investments in infrastructure, and that's actually what Eva Molnar also was aiming at. That's not so good for the state budget. What we have experienced in the Netherlands, when we ask for a road crossing, a level crossing to be replaced by a two-level crossing, for example, between road and rail, then the budget of the government is becoming the constraint. My question would be to Mr. Irigoyen, how do you see the prioritization of investments, and how do you perceive the value of a human being? How do you include that in your investment calculation?
Thank you.
Well, in prioritizing the investments, we have methodologies where you can determine benefit cost analysis to determine how far you go. Obviously, the amount of when you come to putting a value in the benefits of losing lives is a sensitive issue. The country has to come up with some standards here. But in general, this benefit analysis will show that this is a good investment. The question is affordability. Can the country do it? So you are right that's why we are seeing that the approach to road safety cannot be in neither relying on technology on the cars nor on just investing in making safer the infrastructure. It has to also tackle the issue of changing behavior, the way we drive, creating a culture where we recognize that this road safety is a problem that we all share, because otherwise will not be affordable. Just to think in terms of in the developing world, creating these highways with a medium barrier, for example, will cost a fortune. So they will have to prioritize. And it is in this process that, again, an agency that continuously monitors the effect of the public campaigns, the measures that they are undertaking in all this variety of fronts, would be of the essence.
Where does the question here? Yeah.
Dinesh Mohan from the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. First a comment and then a question. The comment, there's some good news from the so-called low-income countries.
Low and middle.
And middle. People are voting with their feet and hands. For example, in India, ordinary villagers and local neighborhoods have forced the government or local authorities to build at least 500,000 speed breakers in the country in the last 10 years, and no one knows how it's happened. The villagers and the local inhabitants are probably shown by this that according to my back of the envelope calculations, we are probably saving 20,000 lives a year without the government doing anything. They also get very upset in many countries if a truck or a bus or a car kills a pedestrian. And so they burn the car. And they're telling the professionals that we don't want these things to happen, unlike developed countries where they want the speed cameras to be taken away. So the people are saying we want safety, but the professionals don't have the answers for them. And I think some of the safety features are really cheap. It's going to be much easier for us to make safer roads than the past, because our infrastructure construction is expanding fast, and safer roads are going to be cheaper than the expensive fast roads which were built in the past. And designs are available. Medians on our highways will be cheaper than the way we are building our highways today in India. And unless we do this analysis, we won't go forward. My understanding is that the late 20th century was a century for a safer car. For our countries, the next 20 years will be saved by safer roads, and they can be done. The question is the World Bank doing studies to find out which roads are safer under the same conditions in each country? Because World Bank funded roads in many countries have one design for 100 kilometers, and then for the next 100 kilometers, there's another design. It'll be really cheap to find out how design makes a difference. Are these studies being sponsored?
All the questions to you, Mr. Irigoyen.
Very good point. We have developed some road safety guidelines for our work, for our staff, and for the design of road projects. in the past we have funded various opportunities, manuals that look at, for example, different designs, intersections that may be more effective than others, and even make comparisons. What you are describing is situations where the same standards are not enforced along, say, a network or a section of the road. That's a different kind of problem, and we try to avoid this in our projects. But also, you mentioned the importance of the local communities, how they can influence this process. And we are seeing this more and more, that when we design, for example, road networks that will cross villages, for example, how this is done, and empowering the village to create a safe zone around the road, making very clear that you are entering an urban area, making it very clear so that you value and you protect your kids in that particular village. This has a tremendous impact.
Second row here, and then over here.
Yeah, Thorsen, the International Pedestrian Federation, president of that, but also of the Spanish Accident Prevention Association. So I try to combine two things here. The first thing is that, of course, you have talked about pedestrians, but not come in maybe into part of the problem of how do we really do our infrastructures with permeability. How could that really be done? Think the road and the street to be able to be crossed safely. And that goes maybe more for road projects in this moment than for city. The Russian minister spoke about light signals in the cities. That's very important, but you cannot put them up everywhere. So one of the problems that we face with the pedestrians is that all normal pedestrian crossings, if they exist, are situated in the domain of the driver. And that cannot be helped only with some rules and with some police. We have to find some other ways of doing it. That's one thing. Another one is to the Swedish minister. I was very glad to hear talking about overtaking. But while we cannot make our roads with mediums 2+1, as you speak about, I normally do it too, we have another problem. That the normal rules for overtaking in the network, in the local roads, they are not thought of for safety. Because there are too many probabilities to have an accident if you follow the rules for, let's say, a permitted overtaking. The Russian minister asked for more standards. If we are not sure that the standards we use in other countries are the correct ones, can we export them? Or should we make a new, let's say, go through our rules and try to get them better? Thank you.
Comments here on the podium? Ms. Swed?
Maybe I just add one way of thinking, or at least try to explain how we are thinking in Sweden, is when it comes to people, it's the door-to-door concept. And that means that when you are leaving home for work, or even leaving home for school, and then we come to children, we have to have this vision that when we're doing the city planning or infra planning and so on, it must be okay to walk or take the bicycle or take the car to a bus station and then change to public transportation or whatever, because I think we have to use all these kinds of modes. So it's the door to door. And especially what we are working more and more of, it's how to make children safe on their own ways. Because we have another problem, that more and more adults like to take their children to school by their own cars. And most of the accidents are when the parents have left their own children and press the gears and have not so much time to go to their own work, and how we can make it more safer there. And when it comes to the 2+1 lanes, then we are taking space to have more lanes, of course. But then comes the next question. How can it be safe to walk there, especially in urban areas? And how can it be safe to take a bicycle there? So that's also the next step.
Thank you. Mr. Irigoyen, you wanted to add?
Yeah, this was an excellent comment, because the historical approach has been to see the road system and then pedestrians should not get into the system, as opposed to a more integrated system where you see mobility, and the pedestrians is a way of mobility as well. So this notion that, for example, in Sweden they have about the forgiven infrastructure has to take into account that there is a legitimate presence of these pedestrians, not to mention kids. So the notion of really a forgiven system has to be even thought in terms of how you protect kids. How many cases we have villages that are crossed by a road, and you have a school across that road, for example, have so many people dying, so many kids dying because of that. So we need to accept that. If you have a bicycle in the middle of a traffic flow of all the cars, it creates immediately a reaction. Why is it this bicycle? Why is it the biker here? It should not be here. No? So there is a paradigm shift in that respect that has to be. So we have to integrate that there's different modes of transport and accept that. And we discussed briefly the issue of blended traffic. I think in the developing world is particularly one of the most critical challenges when you have different combinations. If you have in Vietnam, it was safe when everyone was biking, but the moment you introduced the motorcycles, you created a problem. Or in India, for example, when you have people walking along the road. So the definition of a forgiving system there will require redesigning or rethinking the design of these facilities.
Taking into consideration also that some of those pedestrians, of course, could be disabled. I spoke yesterday with a blind man who said that electric cars that make nice little bell tones are useless to him because he doesn't recognize that it's a car. Here we had in the third row.
Marie-Van Plessis-Fressard from MPF Consult. I wanted to make two comments. First, thank the panel for the very good and complimentary comments. But there is one word which I think was not used here, which was the private sector. And it has become evident, in particular in the work that the World Bank does, that in fact, especially in the developing countries, especially the large companies that generate a lot of traffic on roads, and you can see a big oil company can generate 50 million kilometers of traffic of tanker in Africa, for example, huge, having a huge incentive to road safety, and they can be a tremendous driver for helping both multinational institution and government bring forward the agenda. And the second thing is, this has been said by several panel members regarding the asset management of roads and the fact that to make roads safer, it's very expensive. But I think a lot of technology is just now being transferred from Europe, especially with what the Dutch have done on the star ratings of roads for safety. This is now being adapted to the circumstances of developing countries, and this allows in the normal routine management of the road asset, to bring up the standards of the roads and to manage the road no longer per the asphalt condition, but by the safety of segment. I'm sure Mr. Minister Russia knows exactly what we mean. And I think this will give us an instrument that will be very, very powerful for a change during the decade. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to let that stand as a comment. I have one more question back here. Good, and then one more here, and I'm afraid we'll have to close on those. And if you could keep your question very brief, that would be wonderful. We're a bit over our time. No, sorry, we had one back here as well. Yes, this gentleman here was first on the left, and then... Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ashley Gardner, Herald Sun newspaper in Melbourne, Australia. I'd like to pose this particularly to Catherine King, but would also welcome comment from elsewhere. And I would like you to comment on the issue of governments who apparently do rely too heavily on the revenues generated by speed cameras and the role this plays in undermining the legitimacy of the speed cameras as a road safety initiative.
Thanks very much. It's nice to hear an Australian accent from my home state as well, which is lovely also to hear. Look, I think there is absolutely no doubt that it is incredibly important with speed cameras that people have faith in them, and I think in a number of states and territories in Victoria, and I think in your own newspaper, there's been fairly continuous stories about speed cameras as revenue raisers. I think we absolutely have to debunk that. It's incredibly important. They are a very, very important mechanism for reducing speed, a very important mechanism, particularly point-to-point cameras for lowering the road toll, and it's important that people understand that. But people also have to have faith in them. They obviously have to have faith that they're calibrated effectively and that they're actually meeting what they're designed to do. And I think that's been a challenge for certainly for some governments in Australia.
Thank you. We had one more question back here. Yeah.
We'll maintain the Australasian accents. I'm Matthews from the Ministry of Transport in New Zealand. I'd really just like to make a statement. Much of the discussion we've heard has been about sort of the behavioural dimension of the safe system approach. What I think is interesting about the approach many of us who work in government focus on is how we set the limits and then enforce them. I think one of the great opportunities is to think more about how we build a safety culture in our countries, and the scope that there is to think more about incentives as opposed to sanctions. The way in which we sort of modify the behaviour of our societies by rewarding the desired behaviour we have or are seeking. And I think there are great opportunities, particularly with communications technology, for us to think about incentives-based, rewards-based systems. And indeed, even in the transport system, we can look to the airline industry to see how powerful reward schemes can be to modify traveller behaviour, perhaps not with a safety focus. But I just invite people to just think about whether there's scope for a paradigm shift in the way in which we think about behaviour modification in the safe system approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think the reward for everybody here now is that we slowly end our session and you can have your coffee break. But I would like to thank all of our panelists very warmly for a very interesting and productive exchange, at least I thought, and all of you as well for your attention and for your comments and questions. Many, many thanks. Enjoy your break.